And we're on.
Okay, we are reconvening our meeting and continuing our testimony on H687, and we have Billy Coster and John Austin, both from the Agency of Natural Resources. Welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thanks for having us. For the record, I'm Billy Coster, Director of Planning and Policy for the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources. And I'm here with
John Austin, Director of Wildlife, the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department.
we've been asked to come in to speak to the sections of H682 that address Tier 2 and Tier 3, the jurisdictional tiers of Act 250. So if it's okay with you all, we are going to speak to primarily the road rule component of that, the critical resource area component, and then speak to some extent about the forest block and connecting habitat criteria and mitigation, which are important aspects of the Tier 2 and Tier 3 review. And I just want to remind you all that the agency participated in the Natural Resources Board working group study that delivered a report to you earlier this year with recommendation 50 reform or modernization, excuse me. And as we discussed yesterday, that report and this bill is very aligned in its framework, and it diverges in some details. And we're very supportive of the framework of both the bill and the study, and that we are very interested in seeing that framework move forward as some of the other details are developed. I also just want to reiterate that the agency has been called upon by the legislature in recent years to carry forward a number of really important initiatives, things that are core to our mission and important to Vermonters: work on climate change, environmental justice, administering significant ARPA funds for clean water and helping low-income Vermonters access wastewater systems, working on Act 59 implementation, the 30 by 30 bill. We're deep in the inventory phase right now, looking forward to developing and delivering that plan to you all. And that's all put a pretty significant stress on the agency on top of the work that we've already been doing. And we're really at capacity. So our secretary asked us to just be clear with you all that whatever you envision as new policy or new work initiatives that come to the agency, to be really thoughtful about the staffing and resources that will necessitate that work. And as you can imagine, what's being considered in H687 related to additional Act 250 oversight of these natural resources, that work will largely fall on our agency and to the work of John's department and division. So that said, I'll turn to the specifics of the bill. So as you know, the bill and the NRB study envisions 3 tiers of jurisdiction. A first tier where development usually or partially exempt from Act 250 to help promote growth in areas of the state that are designed and planned for. A middle tier, Tier 2, which is largely similar to existing Act 250 jurisdiction, but includes some sort of a road rule that would trigger Act 250 for encroaching development into areas where development hadn't previously existed. And then a third tier that looks at automatic Act 250 jurisdiction in more sensitive areas. The agency has long supported these concepts, starting with the road rule. Forest fragmentation is something that our agency has been working on for the better part of a decade now, with the initial forest blocking analysis, habitat block maps, and the forest block maps, and then the development of Vermont conservation design, which was led by the Fish and Wildlife Department and many of our partners. And we really have agreed that long roads and driveways that go deep into forests have an outsized impact on those resources, a radiating impact that should be better regulated. And we support a road rule, and we supported the road rule that was proposed in the NRB study. That road rule focuses on a combination of new roads and driveways not to exceed 2,000 feet. While that is not a perfect approach to this issue, it's one that group supported in a consensus way, and we're wary of diverging from that without engagement from those other stakeholders. I think we appreciate that it's not perfect, and we're open to have more conversations about the road rule. I think that the proposal in the current bill that has a 500-foot threshold is an interesting alternative that we would certainly look at. I'm a little concerned that might be so short that it would preclude certain infill opportunities to get at areas where fragmentation is not really a concern, where you may have a housing development out here, a town road here, and there may be some areas in between that are further than 500 feet from a town highway where we could see some development without Act 250 oversight, and that could be appropriate. But again, glad to see there's alignment around the need for a road rule, and those are important details that I hope you can work with us and others to nail down this year.
Representative Smith has a question.
Thank you. Thank you. Has there been any sort of a road rule, so to speak, up to now?
There was one that existed in the past. I don't exactly recall its history. I think it was established in NRB rule, I think.
Yeah.
Rule, and I think it went away as part of a broader reform conversation that happened a number of years ago. I think there were some issues with that because it didn't take into consideration cumulative roads. So people would create these spaghetti lots of single parallel roads, and
Sure.
that's not a land use pattern we want to see. So the recommendation out of the NRB study does look at cumulative impacts associated with roads and driveways to try to get at that issue.
So you'd say that a road that's, say, a mile long or 2 miles long would be infringing on what we try to keep natural forest?
It would have a much larger impact than a development that had a shorter road.
I'm referring to a road that the state built up into the hurricane. You know, I've talked about it before, and I think it's 2 or 3 miles. Are you familiar with it?
I am indeed.
It was an existing logging road years ago, but it's developed now so that you could take probably a front wheel drive car up through it. And it goes quite a ways back into the woods
It does.
and turns around and goes back out. There's no purpose for it to be there.
Well, the purpose is for public access. The road has been in place since prior to the department owning the property. And it had been in a state of horrible disrepair. We were concerned about water quality issues associated with it. And there, with the heightened attention these days on investing in public access to public land, that was an area that we thought seemed appropriate to take an existing road, improve it so people could enjoy parts of the property that were difficult to access.
Sure.
We make those decisions very carefully because of the issues that we're talking about here with respect to Act 250, because roads and their attendant effects and how they allow people to get to areas that maybe they didn't previously have access to have environmental consequences.
What that road does is it makes the deep woods not deep woods anymore, because it makes it very accessible to anybody who wants to drive and not walk.
I would argue that it's the one main road we have into one of our largest wildlife management areas. It's 12,000 acres.
Oh, yeah.
Most of it is, if you want to access it, you're going to have to work really hard. This seemed like an opportunity to make some reasonable improvements to existing infrastructure to address water quality issues and to improve public access.
Thank you.
And John, just before we move on from the road rule, just generally speaking, any thoughts from the department's perspective of, the importance of a road rule as a jurisdictional trigger in Act 250?
Well, I remember our department has been providing technical support to the Act 250 process since its inception. So our scientists have been engaged in providing that technical support for over at least 40 years. We've developed a strong track record of case law. We've created guidelines to deal with various fish and wildlife and habitat resource issues. When we had the road rule, I can remember cases where that jurisdictional trigger was important for dealing with some effects from development that otherwise might have been missed had that not been available. And frankly, we were disappointed when it was eliminated. So having a road rule in some form or fashion, I think would be a great improvement to deal with this committee's interests around forest fragmentation, because that is one of the driving forces of fragmentation is linear infrastructure. So I think your idea is well placed, and I guess the devil's in the details in terms of how you make it work. I wasn't part of the Natural Resources Board consultation process and putting the final recommendations together. So I respect whatever went into the art of compromise to get to where they did. From where I sit, a road rule would be better than no road. So, from an ecological standpoint, 2,000 feet, one of you said it, it's a long road. And that will have environmental consequences. Would we rather have, from an ecological standpoint, would we rather have something shorter? Sure. But I don't want to affect whatever compromise was made to get to the point of consensus so that we could actually move forward, because we've been having this conversation about how to amend Act 250 to find a better balance for how we can effectively support thoughtful growth and development in the state and add provisions to start to consider forest fragmentation and forest health and integrity, which Act 250 doesn't do right now. I would argue, don't let the great be the enemy of the good in this case. We've been sitting around this table for how many years talking about various iterations of an Act 250 reform bill to try and find this balance. I think what you've put in here in terms of forest fragmentation, forest blocks, connectivity, it's really well done with some minor adjustments. And having that in the law would be an enormous benefit for our ability to deal with some necessary environmental protection issues.
I'm curious, either Natural Resources Board or Billy, what mapping was looked at when you came up with the 2,000-foot number? How did you agree? Did anyone look at existing private roads that are already on the landscape and also look at what a 2,000-foot road would do?
So my recollection is that that was the proposal that had been previous pieces of legislation where there had been some agreement around some familiarity. That was the starting place of the conversation. And I think because that had been written on paper in the past and some work had gone into developing it previously, there was some comfort with it. And I don't know that we frankly had the time to go much further than people not being comfortable from moving off of what they'd seen in the past. So I know that VNRC had done some work previously to develop that. I know Charlie Hancock had done some work, I think in the context of the stakeholder group in his role as a consulting forester. But I think folks from the kind of business community were uncertain of what a change in that proposal would do to their interests. So we just didn't get too far in that conversation. So I think what we're signaling today is that we're happy to talk more about what a road rule could look like, but we want to make sure that all those voices are part of that conversation and that we keep that consensus, because we don't want that to derail this larger effort of getting something on the books related to a road.
I'm gonna give the NRB a chance. Did you all map this?
Excuse me?
Did you map this in your conversation and evaluating it?
We didn't map it the way I think that you're saying, no. But there was a lot, I was just gonna add, there was a lot of conversation about the previous road rule and how it used to get gamed. And that adding in the cluster of driveways would be a better way to do it. There was a lot of conversation about whether it should be 800, 2,000. Then there's conversations about as the crow flies, and I think we spent a fair amount of time on the road rule. But that's where the consensus came out.
Representative Smith.
Thank you. Would there be waivers for logging operations if someone needs to go in and go half a mile back to do a 40 or 30 or 40 acre cut? Would there be any, are they going to have to go through an Act 250 permit to build a road to that lot?
Previous iteration, I believe the answer is no. That's certainly not the intent. Previous iterations really focused on roads, servicing, improvements for residential and commercial uses. So not for forest management.
Okay.
If a forest road was to be converted to a driveway at some point for a house, then I think that would be considered, but not for the forest practices themselves.
Good, thank you.
So actually, all this talk of roads is just reminding me of a story I heard about post-flooding and FEMA money now being available to help repair long remote driveways. And I guess I'm curious how the agency, if you were involved in that and what you know about that.
I don't know anything about that. So just in sum, road rule is important, has an outsized effect in enhancing forest integrity. And we're happy to continue to work on the starting place that came out of the NRV study. The second thing we want to touch on briefly is the proposal to add new Act 250 criteria related to forest blocks and connecting habitat. Again, this is something that it's a companion to that road rule. Once the road rule provides you jurisdiction over these encroaching and potentially fragmenting features. And then this criteria gives you the lens to analyze those impacts to see if they're permittable or not. This sort of criteria doesn't currently exist in Act 250, though we've been able to address these issues through the Public Utility Commission's criteria under Section 248 for a number of years. So we have some experience implementing it. We are happy to see this criteria included in the bill, but did have some questions because previous iterations had been focused around a no undue adverse standard, and basically said you can't have an undue adverse impact on forest blocks or connecting habitat if you want to get an Act 250 permit. The current language just requires that applicants avoid or minimize and potentially in some cases mitigate their impacts. And that's a quantitative standard. You're reducing something, but there's no qualitative analysis. Our concern is that with the way that the criteria is currently proposed, if someone was proposing to clear 2 acres of forest, if they minimize their impact to 1.9 acres of forest, have they demonstrated compliance with the criteria? On its face, they may have. And the way that the bill defines fragmentation, it's effectively any subdivision or development within a forested area. So opportunities for avoidance on a forested lot are going to be very limited. So it's really going to come down to that minimization. And when there's a no undue adverse standard or some other qualitative standard, the professionals of Fish and Wildlife can say, okay, have they minimized enough? Have they minimized enough to maintain the functions and values of this resource so that the impacts of the development are not unduly adverse? So we would really encourage you to, if you're going to move ahead with this criteria, to think about reasserting some sort of qualitative standard like a no undue adverse one. That's also the lens that we approach this issue at the Public Utility Commission. And we have had some success in energy and especially telecom projects where we've been able to get significant avoidance and mitigation of both forest blocks and connecting habitat to protect those resources through the undue adverse standard. So that's just another reason we don't want to have to undo some of the progress that we made there. So I don't know, John, if you have any additional thoughts on that topic.
I think you hit it well, Billy. I guess I just offer, based on past experience in dealing with issues related to larger scale forest fragmentation through the Public Utility Commission process. It's because of the scale that you're looking at, typically looking at a forest block or connecting block, and you're looking at development that's somewhere within that block that becomes problematic. It's sort of where the art and the science come together, because our whole approach to this is problem solve. It's typically not to just come out of the gate and say, no, you can't do that. That's not how the process usually works. It's how are we going to try and rescale your project or relocate your project or design it in such a way that we can find some level of compatibility with the resources. And this is where, well, I'll give you a recent example. We had a communications tower proposal in a forest block that and a connecting block that was problematic from our point of view. We thought the ecological effects were going to be quite significant. But it wasn't just about the block itself and where the proposed project was. It was about a lot of different unique features within the block around the project site. And so there were a lot of different considerations that came into play, in one, determining how significant is this area from an ecological standpoint. How significant are the effects of the project going to be, given what we now know about that more specific location within the block? And then 3, what are some reasonable, realistic ways to adjust that project location and design so that they can continue to move forward and we feel confident we've done our job to protect the integrity of the resources? So, there's it's hard to bake that into a set of guidelines that just is sort of a one size fits all. I think what you have here is a really good, it's almost there. I think to Billy's point, we're used to, through the Public Utility Commission process, dealing with that standard of undue adverse. So not to say it has to be that, but we're certainly accustomed to it. So it feels like a reasonable way to go. And then in terms of how you craft the language in the bill such that it gives the practitioners enough flexibility to figure out how to mitigate effects as best we can. So it's avoid, it's minimize, and then it's mitigate. And in many instances where the issues are significant and we get the project redesigned and or relocated, we're still agreeing to some level of impact, and that's where compensation comes in, where in some instances there's significant areas of land that get permanently conserved to offset the permanent effects from the project.
Thanks, John. And that brings me to our next point. There is contemplation for mitigation in the current version of 687 for forest blocks impacts. It seems to preclude the mitigation opportunity for connecting habitat impacts. And all of the mitigation seems to be focused around offsite mitigation that would occur through payments to VHCB that they would use for conservation elsewhere. And that's been a great model for agricultural soils. We've found that with impacts to forest blocks and connecting habitat, often that mitigation really needs to be done at the site where you have a large area, and the only reason the impacts to a portion of it are acceptable is because you're committing to conserve the balance of it in perpetuity. So you can't achieve that outcome by doing mitigation somewhere else. The mitigation really needs to have a nexus with the actual impacts of the project. That's not always the case. There's certainly instances where offsite mitigation can and does make sense. But with many of these projects that implicate forest blocks and connecting habitat, the mitigation is all about kind of keeping what's left so that there's enough resource to maintain the functions and values of that block. So we would just ask that as you're considering the role of mitigation in this criteria, that it not be focused entirely around an offsite payment through VHCB, but contemplates and allows for on-site being negotiated at the time the permit is issued. And then I guess the last thing I would say on that is if you do choose to stay with the offsite framework through VHCB, we would ask that a portion of that fund get reserved for A&R staff associated with the work. Currently with the 9B Ag Soil Mitigation Fund, statute, that money goes to VHCB. They then grant it out to conserve farms elsewhere. They provide an annual grant to the ag agency to support out of that fund to support staff who do the 9B review in the Act 250 process. I believe that's in statute. I think it's 6093B. So would encourage you to take a similar approach with A&R if that's the path to go.
Just to be sure I understand what you're suggesting. I would think you're not saying all of it would be used on site. But currently you're reading language we have to say that it would kind of all go into a fund for essentially offsite. So I'm thinking it would be something more like a both, not a one or the other. Okay.
So and it may just be the way that people interpret the term mitigation. We often see mitigation as not just a payment, but an action, which is, conserving land in perpetuity immediately adjacent to the impacts of a project, right? That's often
That's typically what we do.
Yeah, that's typically what we do. So we're negotiating and resolving that at the time we're reviewing the permit so that we have confidence that the impacts are actually being mitigated in a way that maintains the resource. For some things that are really prevalent across the landscape and the specific location is less important, like Deer Wintering area, potentially that going into a mitigation bank and conserving lands elsewhere, that sometimes works. But for something like a forest block where you're really trying to maintain those interior forest conditions, you want that conservation to happen there in the first instance. In some cases, it's not gonna be feasible, or that block isn't a high enough value that warrants that conservation, and then maybe you're gonna do it someplace else.
I'll just offer, I may have missed this in my uh, read of the bill, but now that I'm sort of getting a better understanding of what you have in mind with a mitigation bank, so to speak, I appreciate the thinking around that, because, I mean, Billy just said, our first course of action, if there's the need for permanent land conservation, our first course of action, and this is based on like the condition and the significance of the resource that we're working to try and figure out how to protect. If it's something that's really high value, and it's part of why it's high value is its position in the landscape, and we really want to focus on conservation there. And that's typically what we do, and we're usually successful with that. But after doing this for a long time, we've got decades of easements that have built up that then become our responsibility to have to steward. And that's all on our backs when you have to pay people to go out and deal with, you know, an accumulation of permit conditions and mitigation settlements and conservation easements. It's additive over time, right? And we haven't grown resources in order to deal with that. So we have given a lot of thought lately to the idea of a mitigation bank, which actually would, if it was used properly, and I wouldn't want it to become a, forgive the metaphor, but a get out of jail free card, like it becomes the cost of doing business, right? Check, and you don't have to deal with the resource issue anymore. That's one of the issues that we've tried hard to avoid, because, you know, there's a reason that we're trying to protect this area in the first place, and it's because the area that is being impacted is significant. But there are cases where a mitigation bank approach could be very helpful, especially from, well, one, from an ecological standpoint, because then it puts the conservation practitioners in a position of making strategic decisions about where to conserve other land that has similar resource values as has been lost by a regulated project, maybe in a better place, and at a scale that it becomes more manageable for the department or whatever other organization or agency is responsible for it. Point is, it gives us another option to make good decisions for the environment, but also to look strategic, because sometimes we're trying to squeeze a square peg through a round hole, so to speak, and conserving land in an area where you know additional development is going to happen over time. And then you make a big investment to try and protect an area, and then 2 years later, 5 years later, you've got the next proposal that's nearby and you're dealing with that. So all to say, a mitigation bank as an option, as one of several tools to deal with this is a wise idea.
And I think, Billy, you said it, but that it may be down to how we're viewing the term mitigation. Because I would think that you also might, in weighing in on the undue adverse standard, like you'd be doing what we anticipate happens here, which is not saying no to development, but having it be better designed and leaving a corridor or a connector or a forest block more intact. I would assume some of those, and I would call that sort of the avoid and minimize more than the mitigate. So for me, getting a permanent easement still could be part of that under avoid and minimize. And then mitigate inherently meant to me offset.
Gotcha. Thank you. That's helpful. So yeah, I think we're all saying the same things and just making sure that nothing precludes that range of options. Be great.
Representative Sebelia.
When we're thinking about mitigating here, do you see any difference in terms of who will be able to mitigate? So the example that I've been giving are my two neighbors that I go walking with on the weekend. One are my neighbors from Connecticut who are up at their second home camp. The other is my fifth generation Vermonter who, is not really that well off. So do you think they'll equally be able to mitigate those situations? What do you think the differences will be?
It's a great question. And I guess where I would start is that hopefully that's not necessary. that especially with large forest blocks, I think our experience and our guidance has been there's ways for people to achieve their development goals by minimizing their impact in a way where mitigation is not even necessary, where they've the level of impact they're having is reasonable. It can be accommodated by its kind of landscape context, and there's no need to do anything more. Where we've typically seen mitigation is for larger scale developments or in places that have like really significant ecological functions, like some of these pinch points in our connected landscape. So I don't know the answer to your question, whether there's a way to have a more equitable approach to this where people who have more means can do it more easily than those who don't. But I would say that generally we don't see this come up as an issue all that often. Is that a fair, at least for like forest blocks and connected area?
Yeah. It's unusual for us to get to a point where we're dealing with the actual permanent conservation of land to offset the effects of a project. We work really hard to try and avoid getting to that place. And it's typically with bigger projects associated with ski areas, energy infrastructure, telecommunications infrastructure. It's less common with small scale residential development.
Does it not happen or is it just less common?
Less common.
Are the tools accessible, I guess is my question. Like, how would my neighbor,
Sure. So there was a somewhat recent example.
how would my neighbor minimize? Like, what would they have to do? My neighbors from Connecticut will hire an attorney. And they'll pay whatever they need to do to hire the resources to deal with all of that. What would my other neighbor have to do? What tools are available?
Well, the primary tool that's available is our department staff. We have staff that work every day in the permit process, providing guidance and support to private landowners who have development interests. And they work really hard to try and help folks design a project that is going to avoid the issue altogether, if that's possible, or get to a point where you end up with some reasonable, realistic permit conditions that work to offset the effects of the project and move on. So the cost to whomever it is, whether it's your neighbor from Connecticut or your neighbor who's the fifth generation Vermonter, are largely the same in that instance. It's the cost of going through the permit process with support from our staff.
I think for something like this, if a new criteria was put into place, I think there's rulemaking contemplated, but even if that wasn't, we would, as an agency, develop guidance and a toolbox of solutions for folks based on our experience with how these issues often arise. So hopefully we would, not only do the kind of one-on-one TA that John's talking about, but have some, written materials fairly detailed about how you can design your projects in ways that don't run afoul of these criteria. So that would be another resource.
That's a good point. And I guess it's a helpful reminder for me. In the past, we've done workshops for consultants and developers and parts of the regulated community about how to identify important resources, where to find information, how to consider the effects of a project, how to design a project to avoid and minimize issues in the first place. If these changes were to go into effect, I would imagine we'd probably want to do some similar outreach and education building to help people understand. Here's how to understand the issue in the context of planning development. Here's some suggestions for how you can do that in a way that could minimize the cost to you, that sort of thing.
That sounds very much like the type of thing that I'm thinking about when we're contemplating this kind of historic, probably necessary change. How do we make it accessible to regular Vermonters, right? And the tools accessible. So when we think about some sort of public engagement or leading on this, those are the types of things. So I appreciate that. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I guess the last thing I'll say about the forest block criteria is that it's really important where it's important because we don't have this tool right now in Act 250. But it also doesn't come up that often in Act 250, right? These are, as John said, usually larger scale developments that are deep in our forests, like ski areas or cell towers, things of that nature. For your general Act 250 commercial residential subdivision, it there's certainly the opportunity for this issue to come up, but it's not as common as most of the other issues that we address. But having it there for when we need it is something that we've long been eager to have access to.
Good point.
Okay, so the last piece that we'll touch on is the tier 3 component of the proposal. Both the NRB study and this bill contemplate expanded areas of automatic Act 250 jurisdiction with the intent to better regulate impacts to especially sensitive or value-rich areas of the state. The NRB study has tier 3, and it basically acknowledges that that tier is necessary and that there's some complex details to be worked out, and that there's an interest in having somewhat of a bottom-up approach through regional planning commissions with assistance from state agencies and other stakeholders to come up with those areas and then bring them back ultimately to the NRB to codify. We support that process. I spoke to it a little bit yesterday. I think that was a kind of a cornerstone to the consensus that the Act 250 study enjoyed, was the acknowledgement that this work is important and complex and needs to work at a pace where both Vermonters and stakeholders can be engaged in it, so there's good outcomes. So we're very supportive of this concept. We're happy to see them in the bill, and that it was highlighted in the study. The critical resource area taken to address this need in H687 is more prescriptive than what the NRB study called for. It does legislate specific resource categories that would fall into this area of automatic jurisdiction. Those include river corridors, significant wetlands, lands above 2,000 feet, lands with steep slopes and shallow depth of bedrock, prime ag soil, and any part of a parcel with connecting habitat. These are all, individually important resources. Some of them already enjoy some level of protection through, say, the state wetlands rules. But cumulatively, they represent a very large footprint in Vermont. I think, probably somewhere between a third and a half of the state, if my math is right. The ag agency shared, they thought prime ag soils were about 276,000 acres. River corridors, our map river corridors are 209,000 acres. That included 12,000 existing buildings and 5,600 miles of river shore. So that's just a real big footprint in Vermont. And when you look at the connecting habitat, Vermont Conservation Design has identified the highest priority connecting blocks in the state, and that totals 2.8 million acres. And I think the definition of connectivity in this bill is actually even broader than what VCD has mapped, potentially, or if they're aligned, it's still a lot of acreage. That's pushing, just of those categories, pushing us over 3 million acres. By comparison, all of the existing state designated centers, the downtowns, villages, neighborhood development areas, growth centers, those total about 22,000 acres. So we're talking more than 100 times more land being proposed for this critical resource area that are in these areas that have been proposed for potential Act 250 exemptions. I'm not going to have any judgment about that. I'm just pointing out that that's a very big disparity, and that the Act 250 Study Committee envisioned a much smaller footprint for Tier 3, that it would be more targeted and focused around areas that were really critical and had really outsized resource values within some of those categories, not categorically saying all connecting habitat, but maybe certain connecting blocks within that 2.8 million acres that had real outside impact in forest health and connectivity. So I just put that out there as a concern. And, again, part of the rationale for why I recommended yesterday that this third tier is a place where some more data informed engagement with stakeholders could be beneficial.
I just want to interject that with connecting habitat, that is what we imagined, is that we would get guidance from you all on those places that were irreplaceable.
Okay.
You've seen the arrows on the map, places that we need to keep connectivity happening, not every block. As you know, many of the blocks are sort of designated in multiple
Yes.
categories. So to grab them all and say they're connecting when, it's like we would certainly look to the creators of Vermont Conservation Design to guide us and narrow that scope significantly. And I would hope that in calculating areas of river corridor that, I don't see this as a quid pro quo. And I'm sort of unfortunate that that's evolved that way. I think most Vermonters agree we need an intact and functioning landscape and that there are resources that are critical to the health of both human communities and natural communities that are significantly greater in area than places that we will call home ourselves, right? And in order for us to maintain access to that landscape for our own renewal, it needs to be intact, but also for our communities to remain safe in the face of climate change, it needs to stay intact. So I guess I'm going to push back a little on this quid pro quo thing on the designations and the tier 3 being somehow the same amount of acres.
No, that's fair. I'm sharing that perspective coming out of that stakeholder group.
Yeah, I would hope that the agency can help provide us guidance on what's critical in the face of all the things I just talked about.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's our intent. I think my point is that there's all these intersecting threads that are somewhat complex. And, Act 250 is not the only tool that we have. There's bills in the Senate right now actively looking at expanding regulatory oversight of river corridors and floodplains. So there's other ways to get at that vision of this connected landscape, protected, connected landscape that you just spoke to, Chair Sheldon. And I think from our perspective, we see Act 250 is really important, but it may be too much if you're really targeting a narrow focus. If you're really trying to maintain river corridors, bringing all 32 sub-criteria of Act 250 to that one house may not be necessary to protect that river corridor. And the resource expectations from issuing a DEC permit for a river corridor impact versus all the work that goes into an Act 250 review is significant. So I think that's another thing we're thinking about, is that not that these areas shouldn't be protected, but what's the most efficient and effective tool to do that?
Absolutely. I introduced the river corridor bill here last year for that reason. And I hope you're supporting it and helping us find a way to do that.
We proposed, what I think Secretary Moore proposed earlier this week, where I think there's some great amendments to make it a feasible approach for the agency to implement.
Representative Sibilia.
So this map, I think, is of the processes, the studies that came through.
Yes.
Yeah. And so, but I want to make sure I understand, because we were all very excited about this. It's helpful, digestible, easy to explain. But here, tier 3 is very tiny. We're talking about tier 2 being a wide part of the land. And so what I'm hearing you say is, as you read this, tier 2 is potentially half.
Yeah, I think
Tier 3 is.
Well, I think the words on the page, how I interpret them, seem to lead to that outcome. What I've just heard Representative Sheldon say is that perhaps that largest piece connecting habitat, her vision is something less than that full 2.8 million acres. So, but yeah, our initial read of this, given the resources that are included, it has a significant footprint on the landscape.
And is this knowable for us, Madam Chair? Like, to get to this kind of slide? How is it known?
It will be knowable, but I think we need further input. We asked Eric Sorensen for his input. I welcome input from the agency and the current staff there on what a critical resource is to Vermont landscape and our communities. And then we can map it. And then, you know what I mean? Like, we need to come to agreement on the words on the page and then look at it.
And then the 2,000 feet and above, how much area is that?
We did some work on that in previous sessions. I didn't have the time to dig that up today, but we can ask, you all may know, I'm sure John Adams may know, but I don't recall off the top of my head, but we can get that information for you.
Interested in that.
Yeah, those are going to overlap with a lot of the other resources that we've discussed, but it is a
2,000 chunk of land. Yeah.
So again, I think that's, I
Yeah.
don't know if you have anything that you want to add to the 2 or 3 comments.
So when you say they're going to overlap, were you double counting?
The
With 3 million.
the 2,000 foot, she was asking about the 2,000 feet of elevation. I didn't include that acreage in these numbers. I just said that connecting habitat may overlap.
I'd love it if you would speak to, if you know, how headwater streams are covered now in Act 250, and that, you know, the 2,000 foot, I think, was put in there as a kind of a holder for like headwater streams. So we saw a lot of those blow out during the floods this past summer and winter.
Right, there is a headwaters criteria. I'm looking at Pete, yes. That has I think either in rule or statute is defined what is meant by headwater. There's the streams criteria 1E, which we generally apply to our review through the Fisheries Division of Fish and Wildlife. And through that, we're looking at any perennial or intermittent stream. So streams don't need to be carrying water all year, as long as there's a defined channel and evidence of sediment movement. That's considered an intermittent stream. And we have a riparian buffer guidance that we apply in Act 250 that calls for a default 50-foot buffer on smaller streams and 100-foot on larger streams and rivers. That's typically a no-touch vegetated buffer. In instances where that default buffer can't be entirely maintained, we are open to working to develop riparian management plans where you may have a little bit more of a buffer impact in one area, but then you're making buffer improvements through plantings or other things in other areas to offset that. So the streams criteria is probably one of the top areas where the agency participates in Act 250. And we've done a tremendous amount of work through the Fisheries Division over the years to move projects away from those riparian areas and to put conditions in Act 250 permits that require the perpetual maintenance of those buffers in a natural state.
And Pete, isn't there a headwater streams like at 1,500 feet? What am I remembering?
Yeah, so you're right to recall that. So, sorry, I had to open the book just to to get there. So when you're looking at it, you're talking about headwaters or watersheds characterized by steep slopes or shallow soils, drainage area of 20 square miles or less, or, and this is what you're thinking of, above 1,500 feet in elevation. And then or watersheds, public water supply is designated by the Agency of Natural Resources. So they're all ors there in terms of what it means to be in that area. And you're looking at making sure that that you're not reducing you're not having a reduction in the quality of the ground or surface waters. Areas.
Interesting. Thanks. Representative.
It's not a jurisdictional thing. It's a criteria thing.
Remind me, in this instance, when we're putting, right now it's 2,500 feet is a jurisdictional trigger, is that right?
Yes.
Wow, yay me. So we're moving it down to or we're proposing here to move that down to 2,000. So I have towns that are in that place. So what is the change that happens in that space?
That means any development, commercial, residential, or otherwise, would automatically require an Act 250 permit. Currently, areas below 2,500 feet have the existing triggers, the number of lots, the size of the parcel. But if it was included in this critical resource area as proposed, it would be automatic jurisdiction for any development in those areas, in any of the areas that are listed.
So my constituent wants to build a garage, Act 250 permit.
I think there will be a challenge how to manage jurisdiction of pre-existing development if these new areas come into play. I don't know what that would do if they wanted to subdivide their parcel into another lot or build a new house. That would definitely trigger. I don't know what's being contemplated for existing development in these areas.
And does anybody know what's being contemplated for existing?
We were going to carve it out.
Great. That sounds good.
So I guess in conclusion, the road rule, the first right criteria, the critical resource areas are all concepts that the agency is supportive of. We think the consensus approach in the NRB study is a good starting place. And that we're happy to work with you all and stakeholders to try to move these concepts further. And that, as I said yesterday, I think there's a real opportunity to, do as much as we can this year, establish this framework that this system is an inevitability and that there may be the need to provide a little bit more time to fill in some of these details.
Thank you for your testimony. Thank you both for coming in. And Representative Stebbins and Sevilla.
Thanks, Madam Chair. A little bit separate, we heard testimony this morning about, separate from this bill, but how long it was taking for corrective actions to be processed. And how that impacts, the goal of using infill locations for priority housing. Is that you? Is that someone else? Who would I ask?
That's the Waste Management and Prevention Division in DEC, Matt Chapman, Subdivision Director. I know that I am the agency's rep on the Vermont Housing Conservation Board, so I work with a lot of the affordable housing developers. So I do have folks like Kathy Byers and others, Matt Moore, call me often when they're having some challenges with that, and I do try to help move that stuff along. But that's complicated work as well. We're trying to make sure that environmental contaminants are not affecting our fellow citizens. But yeah, Matt would be the person. It's his division that works on all that.
Thank you.
Sevilla.
Do you have specific thoughts about implementation timeline? Because I've heard you twice now reference that, and I'm interested in what you think might be feasible. There's some public engagement and other things that we've sort of been talking around also, but your reference, do you have that kind of laid out? Not kind of laid out. Do you have a timeline?
I really want to defer to the NRB. I personally think that if there's two pieces, there's kind of the stakeholder piece, the technical group that would need to come together to do some of this work like they did last summer. I think that defining a tier 2 and some of the other tiers, the parameters for that could certainly happen kind of prior to the next legislative session. Whether that's enough time to do outreach with communities and Vermonters, I don't know. That might need some additional time, but I think the bare bones coming up with the kind of the parameters and definitions of how those critical resource areas would be established, I think could certainly happen before the next session.
So I just want to push on that a little bit. If we're to pass this kind of historic legislation, really, I think that would be critical input from the agency to provide is,
We can certainly do
since it would be you all that would be doing it. So it would be good for us to first understand what you think is possible,
Yes.
and what the limitations might be. And that's another issue that's pretty important to me to understand.
Okay, thank you for that. We'll take that back. And I definitely want to talk with our folks in the Environmental Justice Office and Climate Office around engagement, because that piece I have less of a sense of the timeline around, but we'll bring that all back to you.
Just while we're on that topic, just to go back to what you made at the beginning of this conversation, Billy, regarding capacity. If this moves forward and it goes into effect, and there's some upfront work that's going to need to be done by some of our experts and others, I'd ask that you consider the capacity need to make that happen in a timely fashion. We're really challenged right now with that. We've got our staff just working to support the existing process as it is, in addition to everything else that they're doing. We have staff dedicating an enormous amount of time to the planning effort associated with Act 59, which is fantastic. What a wonderful opportunity. Grateful for it, but it's a heavy lift. This would be very worthwhile, and I would be absolutely delighted if something like this went into effect. It would be time well spent, but we would need the capacity support in order to make it happen in a timely fashion.
Yeah, what does that look like? It'd be great to hear what that looks like back from
I
you.
can tell you off the top of my head.
No, I'm not asking for you to tell me off the top of the head, but if you could look inside and let us know. We would really appreciate it. And we really appreciate you coming in today. Thanks.
Thank you.
There are some suggested timelines in the report.
Yeah, there are. Oh, and then.
We'll look at those. Thank you.
5 months.
Sorry, members, we are going to adjourn for the afternoon. I want to just let everyone know that we have a witness available, ready, for 10 or 15 minutes after the floor. Could you put it up for 10? 15 minutes after the floor tomorrow morning, and then we'll have testimony in the afternoon.